everyone. Welcome to SAW Dialogues 2022, presented by Art and Market in partnership with National Arts Council Singapore as part of the 10th edition of Singapore Art Week. My name is Nadia, and I'm editor at Art and Market. It's great to see all of you here at Gillman Barracks, and to all of our audience joining us digitally on the live stream, welcome. We're glad to have you with us. On the screen now, you can see a QR code that you can scan to access Slido, the app for the Q&A segment. Whether you're physically present here at Gillman Barracks or tuning in virtually from your home, feel free to type in a question for the panelists at any time. We will get to as many questions as possible at the end of the talk. And for those of us joining for those of you joining us virtually, you have the option of turning on the automatic live caption function by clicking on the CC button on your video player. I would now like to introduce the talk for the afternoon, titled Connecting the Dots, Art and Blockchain. Blockchain technology is a relatively new innovation in the art world. How can it be implemented for the benefit of artists, galleries, institutions, and the art market at large? We discuss its strengths and uncertainties and the ways it can transform the future of art making, dealing, and collecting. I would now like to introduce the moderator for this afternoon's panel, Kathleen Ditzig, Independent Curator. Kathleen, over to you.
Thank you, Nadia, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. So obviously, there's a lot that is said about blockchain technologies and NFT, and it seems to certainly be the hot topic this SAW. This afternoon, we have the privilege of having three people who are working and invested in this space, and they're really here to separate the fluff from the fodder. So we have the privilege of Clara Pei, who is the founder of NFT Asia, as well as the art lead and curator of Appetite. We have Jonathan Liu, who is a visual artist and also the co-founder, the founding member of NFT Asia. And lastly, we have Wang Zineng, a founder of Art Agenda. So without further ado, we're just going to jump straight into things, right? So let's get a little bit of a lay of the land. And Clara and Jonathan, could you tell us a bit about how NFT Asia was formed? And maybe in answering this question, give us a quick definition of what NFTs are and how maybe they're different from blockchain technology.
Sure. Okay, sure. Maybe we could start with what is an NFT. So an NFT is a non-fungible token. So by definition, it's a unique digital asset. So this asset is stored on the blockchain, and essentially the NFT functions as a digital proof of authenticity, and it can point towards any digital asset. So that asset could be a JPEG, it could be a video file, or it could be code, but basically it can point towards the ownership of this asset, and oftentimes it's an artwork or collectible.
And I think you can also point them to physical assets like real estate, rare antiquities, or bottles of whiskeys and things like that.
Should I talk a bit about NFT Asia? Sure. So the story of NFT Asia is that, well, anecdotally, I was an independent arts writer, still am, and Art and Market commissioned me to write this piece on NFTs for their inaugural check-in issue. So that was about end of February last year. So I started reaching out to artists, curators, arts workers around Singapore and Southeast Asia who were working with blockchain, and John was one of them. So John was already looking at Bitcoin and, really getting himself acquainted with the NFT and blockchain ecosystem. So we got together and started to have deeper conversations around what NFTs were, what artists were doing at the time, and what artists identified to be opportunities for them in the space. And we realized that there was a lack of voices outside of kind of the West, especially in that time. Most of the kind of bigger artists like Beeple, Xcopy, so on and so forth, were very much centered in that part of the world. And we wanted to connect artists who were in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, to be in the same space, to have conversations, to share information and just knowledge, because we know that the kind of barriers to entry can be so high. So that was the impetus behind NFT Asia.
Yeah, and I think this was in March, so there wasn't a lot of resources available on the internet, on YouTube, for artists to kind of research and just learn about the technology, learn about the implications of using it in the art market. So we wanted to create this hive mind of sorts of people who have been kind of researching into it, and to see what we can learn from each other and how we can support each other in the NFT scene that was really, really small at that time.
It's not a very small community anymore, is it? I mean, can you talk also a little bit about the growth of NFT Asia? Because it's on Discord and it's on Twitter, so it's also something that's essentially online and is sort of, you guys don't have any sort of official sort of structure, and you're really a community online, but that community has grown quite substantially, if I understand.
Yeah, so we're a digital native community. We run it on Discord, and we also have a Twitter. And we started in March with, I think, 5 people, and now we're at 3,300. And I think on Twitter we have like 11,000 followers. So it's grown quite exponentially, especially since the big headline sales with Sotheby's and Christie's. And there's a lot more artists kind of coming into the space and realizing there's a need to have this community to, just to feel at home, and at the same time also be able to ask questions and, find this home for their ideas and the works that they want to do.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, we really started very organically initially just because, we thought it'd be good to have everyone in the same chat room and sharing resources. And then as we grew, we started realizing that there were also a lot of gaps between, say, trad art, like traditional contemporary art ecosystems, the knowledge that lies within that, and what's happening in the NFT kind of art ecosystem. So for example, my background's in art history and curatorial. John, is a fine art artist, photographer, and so we started to see that there were a lot of things such as how to write an artwork description, how to talk about yourself as an artist, because a lot of artists with NFTs are coming to identify as being an artist for the first time. It's the first time they feel licensed to address themselves in such ways. And so there are a lot of different conversations there or different skill sets that we felt we needed to build together. So I think that's also why we've kind of grown over this almost a year, this past year, just because we wanted to create that kind of a space. It's more of a community. We don't really have a specific agenda. We don't we don't necessarily plan to have a certain tokenomics. It's really all about everyone is engaged in this space. We want to see it grow, and we recognize that we're kind of on the onset of this ecosystem growing, and we want to be a part of the cultural conversation.
Thank you so much. Zineng, I think this is a fantastic segue, actually, to talk, to ask you more, Zineng, about the work that you're doing. Because in a sense, we're talking about an online community, and Zineng, you're a known and key market maker for Southeast Asian art, particularly for post-war modern art. And you're also one of the few people in the region who has published scholarship on the regional art market. So you've made a largely under-researched and opaque ecology more discernible to sort of the traditional art world audience, let's say. So with this in mind, how did you become interested in blockchain technologies, and sort of what excites you about this technology?
Well, it is very exciting because a lot of people are coming into this scene, asking a lot of questions, trying out a lot of things. And at this stage of time in the development of blockchain technology and all the byproducts of digital art that's coming up, for a traditional dealer like me, I feel a little bit like a dinosaur in this gathering, because I deal with more physical works of art. At least that has been the basis I've been working so far. Traditional dealers still have to be very open to things. So we are trying to, I come into this project of exploring blockchain technology with the idea that it can help us to facilitate better art market transactions. That's my interest in it, principally.
Yeah, and you did say that you are developing a rubrics for strengthening art market transactions via digital tokens and the blockchain. Could you actually speak more about this?
Yes.
Yeah.
it's, of course, an area which I'm still exploring. And I do know from conversations with a lot of people who are doing the same things, we all are moving along parallel tracks. There may be differences in the way that we conceive of that we understand and conceive of how blockchain technology can help us. But essentially, it is what we like to do, what I like to do, is to be able to connect a physical work of art and trace its movement through time and in collections, across collections, trace it better through blockchain. Yeah, essentially creating a parallel a parallel digital asset that can help us to trace its movement better. And arising out of that, a corresponding kind of transparency, which is something that the conventional art market is not very well known for. Yeah. So there are good intentions here, and really I think we just have to try to find the best ways to do it. A lot of people are exploring, including myself.
Yeah, thank you, Zineng. What it sounds like you're really dealing with is the age-old issue of provenance, right? One of the issues in evaluating art, correct me if I'm wrong, when we're talking about the traditional art market or the traditional art world, is that you're not getting a fake, or that what you're getting, the value is often attributed to collection it was held in before or its historical significance. So what you're actually talking about is a reliable sort of provenance system that the blockchain can sort of provide. So this is very interesting because, you know, a lot of the discussion that we've been having around NFTs, especially in the press, deals with price, right? It deals with the speculative value around digital assets, which suddenly, if you're not perhaps a digital native, you're like, wow, how is a digital file commanding $69.3 million? What is happening here? What is this new alternative asset? But actually, the discussion we're having here is really about how cultural infrastructure may change. We're talking about artist communities, and we're talking about issues that go to the heart of the valuation of the art object in the art market, and traditional issues that have actually not been solved in the history of the art market, right? Transparency that Zineng is also speaking about is very important because when we talk about alternative assets, right, and artists often see as alternative assets, there are narratives that appear around this, around money laundering, around issues of where the capital for an artwork is coming, because obviously when artworks move across borders in very fluid ways. And so actually what you're talking about is sort of the things that people have been calling for the art market for the last 20, 30 years, maybe even longer actually. You'll be surprised. A lot of art market texts that were around in the 1950s talk about the same problems we're having today. So what's very exciting about this conversation and this lay of land that is different from what you might be experiencing outside this panel is really what we're here and getting away from the fluff and getting to the real fodder of this, what blockchain technology can do for the art world and the art scene, is to look at what the infrastructure is possibly doing and what individuals such as yourselves are actually looking into beyond the pure speculation value of the NFT. Okay, so given that we've gotten beyond that into the speculation value, we have to, Clara, we have to talk about right-click and save. Because right-click and save was one of the we must congratulate you, I mean collectively, but I congratulate you. It is an exceptional feat for a young curator to achieve the scale of exhibition that you were able to put together through Appetite with Coin Haiku. So Right Click and Save was an exhibition last year, one of the first ones of NFT art, and it was at the Freeport. And I love the name personally. For me, it was the most brilliant sort of troll, but also one of the most incisive curatorial gestures, because you know it's a show of all these privately owned assets that in principle could be right-clicked and saved, and technically you would have your own version of that. So the title certainly came across as a pun and got to the heart of some of the controversies around ownership and rights when it comes to NFTs and this new technology, right? So could you maybe tease out, Clara, could you maybe tease out some of the concerns of uploading artwork online with regard to copyright and artwork authenticity?
Yeah, of course. So actually before that, I just want to add that Right Click and Save is actually also an homage to Xcopy, who's an NFT artist or crypto artist who's been around since like late 2018. So Right Click Save has always been an argument that some NFT artists would use to kind of counter criticisms against why would I pay for this NFT if I could just download it? Sure, like anyone can download it, but it's a different thing to hold ownership of it. So that's kind of a whole argument behind why NFTs are valuable, right? So with this exhibition, we wanted to point towards that and also to consider whether the parallels between owning, say, a traditional, like, say, a painting, a physical artwork versus like code as an NFT. But in terms of copyright and authenticity, I think that's something that a lot of artists are still trying to navigate, as well as for collectors. For collectors, when they're looking at, say, an NFT artwork, they often talk about performing their due diligence, because you have a lot of different NFT platforms out there, but for some of them, because they pride themselves on decentralization or the lack of kind of a complicated process of onboarding, they don't necessarily fact check or check if the person uploading the artwork is indeed the actual creator of the artwork. And so in that sense, we've read different news about art theft or just copy minting, but it's tricky to navigate around that. These problems have existed well before NFTs and blockchain. They've always been around. But it's just like with NFTs as well, and with people sharing it on Twitter, it becomes a lot more visible. But a lot of people also look at NFTs as then a way to stake your claim. So if you are indeed the original creator, you want to protect kind of your ownership of the artwork, then creating an NFT of the work to kind of put your stamp. It's stored on the blockchain, so to a large degree, it's immutable. It's traceable, so on and so forth. But yeah, there are a lot of conversations, and maybe John wants to add to this, surrounding copyright, ownership, that's, I think, is still very much in development. Like things like Creative Commons zeros, like just coming up. And if you want to jump in.
I think because the space is also still building and the technology is still building. So there are some blockchains that are exploring digital blockchain identity. So it will solve a lot of problems with provenance, because if I'm an artist and it's connected to my identity and I mint a work, this is immutable and it's on the blockchain and it's transparent. So I can trace that. But the problem, or maybe not the problem, but an issue with the current infrastructure is that a lot of collectors and a lot of artists want to remain anonymous. So there is that sense of with decentralization, it comes with anonymity. But if we can use a technology that links to our identity and create that provenance, then people who want to be public with their practice, with their processes, with their collecting, they have a way to prove that with the blockchain.
Thank you. An extension of this, and this is all really fascinating, but there's also a tricky thing when we start to talk about these kinds of technologies, and especially when they're new kinds of technologies. A lot of them are coming out of startup culture and so forth. And Clara, I'm just going to pivot back to you very quickly, because I think that there are a lot of people who want to get into this scene, but also are trying to wrestle with the ethos of what it means to work in this scene, whether it's the ecological cost, which we won't go into great depth now, but also the question of working with big technological companies or startups, and how that culture can sometimes be antithetical to the sort of ethos within the art world, right? Which is sometimes much more social welfare driven. So as someone who clearly has a strong ethos in her practice, as in that you're very aware of the art world's politics, and you yourself are very clear about how you navigate it, and you have obviously just recently worked with a show that featured a lot of venture capitalist collectors, and the critique against them right now is that they're using the art world to kind of evangelize users onto their platforms, and that this is sort of a setup. We've heard this from different corners of the art world. What is actually your advice? What advice would you give to artists, collectors from the traditional art world who actually wish to enter this new appears to them as a new NFT art world.
Well, there's a lot there. I think the first thing I want to share is that the kind of collectors that we worked with for Right Click and Save, they were all crypto native in that they have been around in the blockchain and crypto ecosystem for several years before they even started diving into NFT art and collecting. And for them, getting into the ecosystem was really that this was a technology that was native to the world that they were already operating in. And it's like, oh, now you can have, beautiful artwork that is also attached to it, an NFT. And so that was a natural bridge that then led them towards artwork, digital artwork specifically to start. With that exhibition or with conversations that, NFT Asia has been trying to have as well, we've been thinking about how to then bring along these people who, are now art curious, who do want entry points into the more traditional art ecosystem to look for different ways to support artists who are, looking to work together to then come on board and think about how we can improve practices or diversify kind of funding sources or opportunities for artists who are kind of outside of the NFT ecosystem. But I would say that, the things that we're seeing in, I would say, the NFT market right now isn't necessarily so radically different from the traditional contemporary art market. If you're looking at the people who are funding startups or platforms in the NFT world, you would see similar names behind, say, different art market events or fairs. So in some ways, I don't think that, they're really so divisive, but I do think that if this is happening, if the cultural conversation is happening with NFTs, then it's also important for people who have certain questions, who are interested in, thinking about building better practices, who are interested in perhaps, just being a part of the conversation so that you can bring your learnings from, the art world, things that you have identified to be more ethical, to be more equitable, and then bringing that into the conversation. That's something we're trying to do with NFT Asia as well, or from like a curator's point of view, to treat, digital artworks or works that are being minted as NFTs with the same kind of respect that you would as a contemporary artwork, because they're not so different in nature. And I think if you're bringing the rigor into that, and you're, at this point, I think we're still kind of early on to be setting the tone, to be setting up, to be setting precedent for what's to come, then I feel like at least, we're kind of claiming stake, and we can say that we, are working towards that direction.
Thank you. That's actually a really inspiring answer, because in so many ways, there is resistance within the traditional art world. There are accusations of huge speculation, but it really sounds like what it is that there is maybe a cultural shift, and it's a coming together of different positionalities that is very productive. So thank you. That's actually a very inspiring and informative answer. Zineng, if you don't mind, I'd like to get your opinion on this, because I think that in a recent radio interview, you actually said something very interesting about the popularity of NFTs and the evolution of the art buyer tied to COVID, moving people to online transactions, millennial collectors entering the art market, and that NFTs generally offered a new redistribution of capital. So you noted, coming out of this specific intersections of these elements, that there was sort of an evolution of a new art buyer coming out of this. That now people are open to buying shares of collections, let's say, So can you talk about these shifts and their relationship to blockchain? Because I think, in a sense, it builds off of what Clara is actually saying about the ways in which new cultural infrastructure is being built by the meeting of different positionalities, and that actually these are not such different positions.
Yes, in that sense, the NFT market and the traditional art markets around modern and contemporary art function in many same ways. When you think about having blockchain technology as a basis, the foundation to understand the underpinnings of NFT and digital art, then it provides utility because the technology helps in certain ways to establish authenticity, provenance. But if you were to think about just market marketplace, market forces, then these forces don't, like Clara was saying earlier, players are constituted the same way. Many so-called backers of certain market forces, they exist in both scenes. Yeah, so indeed that would be the case. Yeah.
If you don't mind, I'm going to prod you a little bit more on that.
Yes.
Because there's also something interesting that's happening here, which I think that you were kind of getting at, which is that, sometimes when we talk about the art market, we think it's a collector who buys one work and the names and the associations. But one of the things that you shared about that's also coming out of these are new formations of collecting, where you're collecting as a collective. And collections are now, what's very interesting about the latest discourse around NFT art, which maybe is a nice reflection and a moment for us to ponder upon traditional art and the history of traditional art collecting, is the place of the collection and how much the collection becomes important. And I want to prod you a little more in this sense, because as a dealer, I wonder whether you're seeing new paradigms of collective ownership of collections or artworks, and whether this is something that the technology is sort of amplifying and sort of bringing to fruition, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. The technology is the thing that enables easier fractionalization, easier splitting up of value, splitting up of a valuable asset. So that's definitely something that you see much more in the world of NFTs rather than with physical works of art, because it's much rather harder to break these physical things up. So in the past, or rather, even right now, when you think about physical works of art, the way that one might share would be you would have to exist in a community. You would have to know other collectors in the scene, and you might form groups that would then, because of shared beliefs, come into supporting an artist's body of work, come to participate in a market, come to buy something. With the advent of the digital age and a lot of art world activities migrating digitally, you don't have, you can, that anonymity and that ability to exist in virtual digital communities is heightened. And because of that, you do not need to form traditional communities anymore. I can't just have a crypto account, and my account exists alongside other people's, and communities are much easily formed around these kind of virtual identities. So you were talking earlier, Jonathan, about these kind of the identities, isn't it? The anonymity of things. And I think it can be useful somewhat, yeah, to, at least in terms of the market. Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, the kind of identity issue.
Yeah, and maybe to add on to that, with this, because like back in 2017, if you had Bitcoin or Ethereum, you could buy a coffee at like a Bitcoin cafe, right? So there wasn't a big use case for cryptocurrency. But fast forwarded to 2020, NFTs were picking up steam, and people started to find new use cases to spend their cryptocurrency. And what happened was there is this expansion of people consuming and supporting artists. You have new forms of capital coming into the market where they will go to artists working with NFTs or minting their digital works as NFTs that were previously much more difficult to commodify in the traditional market, like with video art, performance art, or kind of other digital forms of art. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on with commodification or fractionalization of ownership. I think it's also important to consider the fact that in those ways, we're kind of talking about NFT and art as asset classes. Mm-hmm. So if you draw parallels between the ways in which the art market or the investment market has treated artworks as asset classes, that's how I think some people are approaching NFTs, where NFTs then create this more liquid, highly tradable, kind of high risk, high rewards market in parallel to the traditional art market, where people are looking at specifically for investments. And that's where I think a lot of these like fractionalized ownership, the commodification of different, especially digital mediums that were harder before, comes into play.
No, thank you. Thank you for that clarification, because in a sense, as this conversation is evolving, what we're kind of seeing, or what we are kind of like moving towards, is really the questions around community, structuring of ownership. And obviously, these are the very fundamentals of politics today. Like, what is private property? What is whatever, right? What does it mean to be part of a community? What is our identity? How do we form connections? All of these things. And so I'm very curious about how there is so much speculation around it, right? That's happening around NFTs. And as you're right, the liquidity around this is that people kind of want to get in and they want to play the market and they want to flip and they want to, but, and there's an intelligence to that, right? But the question is, I'm wondering, what are the communities that are coming out of it? Are we looking at, let's say, collecting becoming more democratized in the sense that now the price point for entry is now lower, let's say? I mean, this is not new. There have been art funds that have done this, where you buy almost stakes in the fund and you own it collectively with a bunch of people. But here, maybe this is happening on a more personal level. The technology makes it much more personal. Just a question. But I feel like the next questions that we have to start talking about is really who's benefiting from all of this. Are artists benefiting from this? Is this moment of the rush to speculation providing artists with opportunities to make money? Because one of the things about the art world, and we all, as a dealer, as an artist, as a curator, we feel this everywhere, sort of the limited demand there is sometimes, or the limited resources that spread thin across multiple people. And we're not just talking in Singapore, which obviously has a much more state-driven funding model, right? But this is around the world. And artists are constantly looking for opportunities to survive, to sustain their practices. And, when it comes to the NFT gold rush per se, I'm using this in scare quotes because clearly it's not also a gold rush. But it's promising an opportunity here for some people. And I was hoping you guys could also speak to that, because there's new research coming out that the typical trade's only $15, and the scale of trading happening on these platforms is actually much smaller than what the hype is promising. So I'm Jonathan and Clara, or even Zineng, if you have a response to that, I am actually curious, how are artists benefiting from this?
I think because of the buzz that headlines try to draw up with, large sales like Beeple or even the collectible sales, people tend to forget that, the network of artists, it's beyond that. And from our perspective within NFT Asia, we are able to see this very fascinating convergence of different artists coming together. So we have traditional artists, we have digital artists, we have poets, we have coders and programmers coming into the space. And we see firsthand how some of these sales can change their lives in terms of kickstarting an art career. Because comparing artists who live in cities with art markets that are less developed than Singapore, they might not have as many opportunities to be able to sell their work or meet collectors or meet galleries and show them some of their work. And with NFTs, they are able to, if they're able to mint their work, put it out there, and they can just hop onto Twitter to show everyone what they have created, what they have minted, and market it that way. It's not a sure thing. Like for artists who are thinking about coming into the space, not every artist who mint NFTs sell their NFTs. And especially with the lack of knowledge with gas prices and things like that, you might end up spending money to mint your work and not being able to sell them because, either with a lack of marketing or other kind of factors that affect collecting and collectors, liking your work.
I think there's like two main things that John's trying to point towards, right? One is like ease of One is ease of access. So for artists of like different digital mediums, especially if say they have a strong background in graphic design or 3D rendering, perhaps that was kind of perhaps those works were seen as belonging to different conversations prior. But with NFTs, they can claim that as artwork. They can really, put it out there. And through Twitter, through NFT platforms, through this digital native kind of community structure, to be connected to a wider audience and to actually seek for and be connected with collectors who truly love their work. And then the second thing is ease of transaction. So if you're already like a digital native, like someone who's fluent in cryptocurrency and the whole like ecology behind blockchain, and you're plugged in, so it's easier for you to then immediately go onto a platform, for example, see John's artwork on Foundation or something, and then say, I want to buy this, and immediately place in a bid. Within 24 hours, it's sold. It's belonging in your collection. And it all is within that digital loop. So I think for artists, these are two kind of the main advantages or things that kind of change the interaction for them to putting work out there with NFTs.
Yeah, I mean, Zineng, before you respond, I just want to echo what is being said, and also to clarify, Jonathan, could you just maybe define for our audience what a gas price?
So gas fees are basically fees that you pay a validator who validates transactions on a blockchain. So taking Ethereum, for example, if there's a lot of people using the Ethereum network at the same time, miners would usually take the transaction that offers them the most money to validate first. So if there's, if let's say they can process 17 transactions a second, and there's 100 transactions a second, you will be queued. And if there are a lot of people trying to use the network at the same time, this can drive up the prices of gas. So if, for example, there is, someone is dropping a collection of collectibles and 100,000 people are trying to buy it, and you're there trying to mint an artwork that has no relevance to that collection, but you're still using the same network, and you would still have to pay that gas at that time. So there is that need of understanding how that structure works before kind of going into it.
So what you're basically also saying is that you could pay your gas fees, and that's actually more than how much you actually make on your transaction, so you go into a deficit as well. In principle. We're talking theoretics here, but I'm just trying to understand the implications.
So that's in context of a proof of work blockchain. So there are alternatives like Tezos, Solana, Cardano. They use a proof of stake blockchain. So that would significantly decrease gas prices, but loses loses a little bit of security. Because proof of work blockchains are safer because they are harder to manipulate in that sense. So everyone's still trying to build the perfect blockchain. Ethereum is transitioning into their proof of stake protocol. So everyone's still trying to build and try to find the best way around paying too much fees with transactions.
So there's a lot of opportunity, definitely. Zineng, sorry, did you want to contribute to that?
Yes, I thought the way that our conversation is going is very interesting regarding the point of access. We've been talking about artists and traditional non-artists. And I think we might not have touched on the roles of public institutions exploring blockchain. And I'm reminded of a news article that came up on my phone earlier when I was coming in. Another new blockchain museum being built in the US. To me, it sounds like the first, but in conversation with Jonathan, maybe there have been earlier things happening. And then I'm reminded that actually, when you think about this increasing digitization of art, the museums have this treasure trove of physical things, which in today's age is increasingly being brought out into the open. The British Museum has recently made NFTs of a suite of Hokusai prints, and they've been serialized and editioned in very specific tiers and made into NFTs that would, we do not know the future market prospects of these things. But right now, it's very exciting to know that you can access very great traditional art in this new way. And so the idea of access here is important. Digital art, NFTs, broaden the market. It actually broadens access to anyone to art. You can literally now own a piece of museum quality art. And closer to home as well, I remember it was just pretty much last year that I think the National Gallery Singapore put up several artworks from the national collection for adoption. It is, in this sense, a case study of fractionalization of art. For a certain sum of money, and this is fiat currency that we're talking about, that contribution allows you to own 1 pixel or a few pixels of the art. And with it, it brings certain benefits, certain traditional museum access. And that is a very rudimentary form of fractionalization. And you don't take actual ownership in that sense. But it promotes awareness, it promotes access, and therefore it's very good, I should say.
I think you're actually raising a very important question, because we've been talking about speculation, we've been talking about the market, we've been talking about the fact that there are many different options, actually, because the technology is still emerging. So a lot of these things are not necessarily cast in stone. The system is still making itself, it's still evolving. There's a way, in a sense, that artists can play a role in guiding it to one that really speaks towards more equal treatment, more towards sustainability. We can apply it towards certain needs that are long-standing in the art market. So this really then leads, the question is, what's the role of the public institution in this space, And I think that's a very important question, because one of the things that, and not to say that my own question is very important, but the point being that what you, one of the things, Clara and Jonathan, what you brought up, and that which has been reported a lot in the press, is really what a disruptor this technology is for artists. Artists who, let's say, don't have access into the very centralized systems of, top-tier galleries, moving on to museums, and so forth. Yeah?
I think your mic is a bit...
Oh, I'm so sorry. Sorry, yeah. Top-tier galleries and so forth. And a lot of these artists are breaking out of those paths and finding their way and creating a career outside of this completely. And actually, a lot of them found themselves into C-Focus this year, right, for the first time. And, so we're seeing them actually move into... So this is really the kind of positive disruptions, right, that we can say that technology can really bring. So given that all of this is happening, and you guys are different players who are interested in this technology, what do you see the role of public institutions? Because traditionally, they're the ones, protecting value of public artworks, so forth. So what I mean by protecting value is, they're telling us what are the important artworks for our heritage, what are the important works for our culture, but in the process, that ties to the art market, and that also ties to the whole ecology around artistic production and an artistic career. So what is their role technically? Because it almost sounds like they don't need to play a role in any of this.
Maybe before we dive into that, we could start with defining what is a public institution in this situation.
So I would say a museum. Let's talk about museum, but then let's also, let's start with a museum, and then we'll move on from a museum to the question of what's a public funding body's role in this?
So a public museum, like taxpayers
Yes.
funded? Okay.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to dive in, or?
It's like the case study earlier with enabling access to traditional great works of art. That it can be reinforcing. The role of the museum here with regards to digital art is reinforcing, because it chooses to allow certain works greater access to the public, or to allow a greater public to access some of his pieces in non-traditional ways. There can be so many other ways that a museum can be a player in it, and it does need a lot of thinking because, and as we're now gathering very clearly, the scene is changing in big ways, big shifts, daily, weekly. So I can only think about this particular reinforcing factor right now. I don't know if the both of you and Kate as well.
Well, I think with NFTs, we have discovered that there's a lot of different artists who have been left out of conversations and left out of exhibitions at museums. So maybe what this presents is an opportunity for them to look into more of these art forms, especially working with, if they're able to support digital communities that are popping up, all over the world in terms of, showing what kind of works are possible with blockchain technology, like generative algorithmic work, for example. And I think this presents them an opportunity for them to, because judging from the experience we've had this week, by having a physical exhibition for digital works is still a very validating experience for a lot of artists and their careers and their practice. So for digital communities like NFT Asia, we don't work out of a physical space. And I think maybe where these institutions can come in is to provide that support, because you have space, and if you're interested to explore what could be possible together, then there can be collaboration in that sense.
Yeah, and I think for institutions, it's one thing to exhibit NFT artworks or to be, supporting curatorial efforts behind NFTs, and it's another to adopt NFTs themselves and to be minting. With institutions showing NFT works, we've seen that from even prior to ERC 721, prior to NFTs as we know them, in 2018, 2019, different institutions and different parts of the world have been showing, say, crypto art or artworks that are about blockchain or that use blockchain technology. But with institutions adopting NFTs or minting NFTs, for example, what Zineng was talking about with the British Museum and the Hokusai job, that's kind of a more recent exploration, I would say. And I think before a museum or a public institution goes into this direction, they also have to decide for themselves, because NFTs are fundamentally about crypto and about blockchain. And you have to engage in this economy in order to mint an NFT. So I think that's something that an institution has to consider prior. But there are also examples in which an institution can interact with the minting of an NFT artwork with other forms of support. Rafiq Anadol, an AI new media artist, did this drop recently with MoMA, where he trained his generative art model on a large data set of MoMA's collection, then released this new artwork that feeds off of MoMA's collection, but is a new media artwork that is in kind of his very signature visual language and minted on Ferrofile, which is a gallery run by an AI artist and very much NFT native. So that's another alternative way of participating for institutions as well.
I hear you completely. So what's clearly coming out is that really, when it comes to museums and by vein of public institution museums here, that there really needs to be a critical thinking around this. And that really what it is about accessibility. That should be paramount. That obviously there's still a desire for sort of these traditional presentations, and therefore the value-making process of the museum is still very important, which means that the museum still has a role to play in the marketplace. But what you're actually saying, Clara, is it's more than just the art market we're talking about. We're also talking about crypto. So it's almost like a museum has to think about the larger landscape. What is MAS saying about crypto? What is the role, what are these other things? Because if you're a public institution, these are things you have to think about. It's very different than if you're acting for private interest, which is what I'm hearing, because in a sense, the public institution would need to serve everyone on this table plus everyone else in the audience, which is a whole different paradigm when we're talking about a landscape that's still emerging. So to extend, we have a number of questions actually coming in from the public right now, so our online audience. So I'm going to transition to this at this point. If we have extra time, we'll return to the question on other forms of public institutions, unless any of you want to address that first. Because I think you've already addressed it very specifically in the way you've answered the questions around museums, because you've literally taken us through thinking, oh, yes.
Yeah, maybe I can add one thing. I think just building off of what John was saying with, say, institutions providing, support for, say, these kinds of new artist networks to form and to grow. I think another big part that I think would be really interesting for institutions and museums to consider is also either funding or providing spaces for critical discourse or research and, writing and speculating around the NFT ecosystem.
Okay, so you have just brought up something that I think is a very important point that we've had separate to this panel and discussions before about the lack of critical engagement actually with NFT art or this emergence field, and because a lot of people are hamstringed. They can't really speak about it because they can't speak critically to it because their sustainability is tied to it, the network is tied to it. And so far in this emergent landscape, could you tell us a little bit about this actual critical need? Like, what is the space that is actually needed for the kind of critical discourse?
Should we start with Zineng?
Oh no, if you could answer because you brought it up first,
Okay.
and then Zineng,
But I do have a couple of
Zineng, if you
issues.
could add in after, just because Clara, I'm asking you to actually clarify your point.
Sure. Yeah, so my point is that I think, right now, at least the bulk of what we see with participants engaging with the NFT market and ecosystem comes more from these market forces that we've been bringing up. And the market moves extremely quickly in crypto and with NFTs. And so I think the space lends itself to moving very, very quickly and putting out content quickly. But I think critical discourse can be, sometimes function in opposition to how this market is functioning. And it can be harder to, as how you started the conversation with trying to discern fodder from, all the noise out there. So I think what is needed is for more dialogue such as this one, or more just room for education, increasing literacy, bridging between different kinds of communities that engage with or around and outside of NFTs to then hold more space for conversations on what are actual good practices or what does an equitable art community look like, and then bridging between those two, but also to encourage, I want to say academic discourse, to encourage more kind of critical curatorial thought between the two. I think, a lot of people in the NFT ecosystem as well feel that they have been rejected by the contemporary art world, or that curators and art historians are sometimes seen as gatekeepers because they think that this part of the art economy isn't being accepted. And if there could be more space for there to be bridging interoperability between these two economies, I think we would all benefit from just improved discourse, more space for slower kind of thoughtful conversations, so on and so forth.
No, I hear you completely, and as someone with a similar ethos to you, I second that. But Zineng, could you add to that? Because I think that this is actually a perennial issue to art, not just NFT art. I mean, we've been talking about this in terms of the writing of Southeast Asian, modern and contemporary art history. There aren't as much resources. I mean, of course, there have been with NGS and other funding going towards publications and so forth within the last 10 years, but this is actually very recent. So, Zineng, I would love to hear your opinion on this.
Yeah, these recent developments give us the space to think about perennial issues as you identify. And for me, the most critical issues to really think about are intellectual property and copyrights. Yeah, it is in this space that we can precisely think about these two issues more. When you think about traditional physical art, because it's tangible, there's always the assumption that ownership can be whole and things can be, in discrete, unbroken bodies. But with NFTs, additioning serialization becomes so much more common. and we accept that there will be versions of things, copies of things, a physical version of a piece of art will have its digital asset. So all of these wrap around the issue of copyrights and intellectual property. And I haven't worked my head around this issue as well. But I would love to hear more thinking, institutionally led thinking perhaps, on this matter.
I think you brought something up that's really important. And I don't know, Jonathan and Clara, if you want to add to that, but we do have a growing list of questions from the public. But one point I want is I just want to reaffirm what you just said, Zineng, in relation to what Clara was talking about and Jonathan has been talking about. You know, when we talk about critical discourse and we're talking really about, you know, a lot of the things is we're looking at what's happening with NFT art and these new aesthetics, and people are like, I don't like, but that doesn't mean anything, right? You know, we kind of need to actually create a discourse and contextualize what like, don't like means, or why certain types of aesthetics are emerging and what are the societal significance of it, right? But this also lends to your question about intellectual rights, about copyright, because we assume that copyright and intellectual rights function the same way around the world, but it actually does not. And a lot of times the growth of, critical discourse is tied very much to the legal structures around these things. And what are the opportunities that can come out of the blockchain technology if, we're moving beyond national borders, per se, of legal systems, because we're on the blockchain now, right? So these are very important questions, ones that, I hope definitely institutions pick up, because as you're right, these are the kinds of things, these are the types of questions that need to be cited in public institutions and not in private spaces or within the marketplace, because these are ones that have larger regulatory and access questions. Now, and what I will say to that, and just one last thing, is that what we're talking about here today is actually quite specific to the Singapore context, because when we start talking about, and Singapore context and a number of other contexts, but we should not assume that the hype around NFT art is a blanket condition across Asia, which I'm sure that you guys have actually hinted at in a number of your answers to today's panel, but also the options and the opportunity that's perceived in this space is different based on the societies and based on the legal and public and private support that's there. So this is something that we also have to keep in mind as we're collaborating and building these sort of spaces. So, not to hog the mic more, I want to invite the public, our public audience online and in person. If you have more questions, please use the Slido QR code that you should be visible to you if you're online and here in person. I'm going to jump into some of the questions from the public because we have about 20 minutes for this. So actually growing from this conversation that we're having, one of the questions is, what is the role of curators and marketplaces, OpenSea, Rarible, etc., given that one of the significances of NFT is giving artists more power and authority? I know this returns to some of the things we've talked about, but who would like to eat into this question? So the question again is, what is the role of curators and marketplaces such as OpenSea, Rarible, etc.?
Maybe we can separate the curator part and the platforms part. I think we've had a chat about the roles that curators can play within the NFT space. Maybe you would like to share a bit.
I was thinking maybe the artists could start with talking about how platforms serve you, or how do you interact with them?
Well, with NFTs, there are kind of different platforms available. There's platforms like OpenSea, where it's more publicly accessible, available for everyone. And then there are the more kind of curated platforms, quote unquote, with Foundation, Super Rare, and things like that. So I think the role that they play is to facilitate and, in a sense, curate a collection of artists that are exploring, a certain kind of genres, and perhaps what they can play is to expand on that as well. So, in a sense, maybe this points to a need of more platforms that are generally focused on one thing, rather than more platforms that want to do all at the same time to kind of take over the market share of things. This has been debated within artists in the space of what a platform's role is, because they do take a commission or royalty from your sales. So a lot of them take about 15%. And the discussion here surrounds what is this 15% going to? Is it going into education? Is it going into marketing? Is it going into promotion of a specific artist? Because the role of a traditional gallery, they take 40, 50%. It's because they take care of what the artist is unable to do. They put you on the map, they invite people, they have events for you. But with platforms like Foundation or Super Rare, they just exist for you to upload your work onto. So the question what they have to figure out is what should their role be in exchange for this 15% in this alternative digital economy.
And I think from a more curatorial kind of perspective, when we think about what the role of a curator is, it's actually extremely broad, right? Because it's not just selecting artworks and putting them on the wall, but it's also narrative making. It's about creative, conducive environments for which artworks can be talked about and looked at. And it's also about, I think, contributing towards the shaping of the art historical, cultural conversation that this moment is within. So I think actually most of the NFT artists or artists dealing with NFTs that we've spoken to are all in agreement that the role of curators is still very much necessary and needed in the space, because there's so much work that is being produced and uploaded as NFTs. And it can be really important and make a huge difference for artists themselves even, as well as the collectors and anyone who is interacting with the space, to see how this work in particular can be situated not just within the wider NFT ecosystem, but within wider art history. So I think curators have the role to play with that, but also curators in different kind of capacities that we've witnessed in the space can either be advocates or advocates for how different people can work with artists ethically. Curators can play the role of educating or kind of providing support for collectors or just interested people who want to curate their own metaverse galleries to think about how to navigate with space, how artworks can talk to each other if they're on the same wall. And these are all things that are within kind of the curator's broad responsibilities. And yeah, so I think broadly speaking, many players that are within the kind of traditional art market and ecosystem, such as curators, such as dealers, such as representatives of artists, so on and so forth, still have roles and responsibilities that can play out in the NFT market. Yeah.
Thank you. Zineng, did you want to add to that? If not, I have specific questions for you from the audience.
Oh, so, maybe I can add on
to
that a little bit. Because with a lot of exhibitions that are talking about NFTs these days, it's usually a row of screens and just artists kind of going through, and there isn't, like what Clara shared about that narrative kind of bringing together a presentation. So perhaps the role of a curator can even be to critique the space itself, to critique the technology, to usher in change, because there are problems with the technology, there are problems with the infrastructure that needs to be talked about, and these can be done through putting on exhibitions and works that interact with that problem.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a very nice little clarity, because I think a lot of times, as a curator myself, as you guys know, one of the things is being actually sensitive to the histories of display, and are we looking at a new paradigm of display with these kinds of artworks? Actually, no, right? But then the discourse, the limitations around discourse are we're not talking to each other and not sort of developing upon that. So, these are very important points to the question that, thank you for your question in the public, about the role of curators and marketplaces, which actually goes beyond just value creation. Zineng, I don't know if you wanted to add, but there are a number of questions from the audience that I'm going to bundle them, because some of them are really, I think, ones that might you be able to answer. So the first one is, and these are a bit overlapping, would people still buy your digital art if there wasn't any resale value or trading value? Question mark. So I'm asking you as a trader, as a dealer. Then the second question is, do you have to be a renowned artist to monetize your work? Just since you're someone in the business of actually.
Once I've sold my 100 NFT, then I would be in a better position to answer this question. But no. To the first question, I think essentially some people do come into art collecting and buying with an investment awareness. And because of that, you do want to ensure the resellability of the art that you acquire. And that's just one perspective amongst many, because a great deal of the art that we see, it should be an instinctual response, it should be an aesthetic response. So the paradigm that we talked about earlier, the I like, I don't like kind, relating to displays and all, these are all part of the bigger question of aesthetics. As this thing is very new, the aesthetic standards is being formed, and most of displays are therefore being experimented upon. Rows and rows of screens, as we see them, would evolve in good time. During the next art fair we see, there will not be rows and rows of screens anymore. There'll probably be something else. Yeah. So I would just go back to the idea of aesthetics. People's concerns should be with the aesthetics of the art and its place within art history. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to tag on one question from there because we have actually quite a few from the public. Thank you very much for we have a lot of actually very insightful questions, but this one is specific and an extension to that. So we're talking about aesthetics, right? This person is asking, what does blockchain technology mean for me if I'm trying to buy art for the first time?
Clara and John, you would add in on this point also, but let's just say if you were buying a existing work of art, a physical thing that has a digital asset tagged to it, it should, in theory, help you to be even more assured of the ownership of your work, because you do not just own the physical object, but you also own the digital asset that comes along with it. It would also mean that you would change your archiving practices a little, or if you're becoming more serious about collecting, and you were to be gathering all of these certificates of authenticity, records of my purchase, records of where the artwork might have been exhibited and all. Blockchain technology theoretically helps you to document all of this, but only if at a later advanced stage in time when more players are involved in the scene. Right this moment in time, not yet. To be honest, blockchain technology won't help you so much in your first work to add on another dimension to it. But in the future, definitely.
I think to add that on, there's also the aspect of the perpetual royalties to the artists. In the smart contract, which is the underlying contract that facilitates the trade, you can specify for every subsequent sales of your artwork that a fixed percentage of the sales would always come back to you. And I think traditionally a lot of artists who sell their works on secondary markets, and after that they don't really see that royalty go back to them. And this smart contract protocol just ensures that that will stay that way and be immutable.
Yes, if I can just add on to this point, in the traditional artwork, we call that the ARR, the artist resale right, and a certain percentage of resale goes back to the original creator. And indeed, this is one really applicable, beneficial aspects of having a blockchain track your art. Yeah.
There's actually something quite poetic and productive about what you just shared as well, because it's almost like if we talk about NFTs and we talk about this technology as a medium, right, an artistic medium, now we're also thinking about the very life cycle of an artist being embedded within the artwork itself, which is something that sometimes when artworks are treated as pure commodities and something that's sold and owned by someone else, escapes that, right? So there's actually something very poetic. Well, maybe here I am contributing to your desire for discourse. someone can take that idea and run with that and make something theoretical around that. But there's something to this also, which I think is a sea change around how artists are seeing themselves, and also how artists are seeing themselves within larger ecologies. So there is a question from here that was published earlier, that was posted earlier, and this is just generally for you guys, and we'll take this as a very short one because actually there are very specific ones coming out, but just growing from this. Do you think people currently see NFTs as more of a financial asset than works of art?
I think both.
Yeah.
Because there is the side of art in single edition artworks, and then there's also the collectible art section. So I think both sides operate in their very unique ways of economics.
Yeah, and I think when you actually look at the NFT market, it's extremely vast. So it really depends on who the creator is, who the collectors are, but also keeping in mind that there are different artworks that didn't necessarily need to take the form of an NFT. And there may be certain reasons why it has. And I think tradability or ease of sale and distribution is a part of that. So in a way, I don't think that the market can be entirely removed from the conversation about NFTs, but maybe that's okay, right?
Yeah. I mean, Zineng, if I can expand and tweak this for you specifically, because it's very interesting what you're saying, that at this current moment, if you're getting into it, it's not as important as maybe further down the line if we're talking about creating provenance checks. And, one has to wonder, right? There are collectors out there who are categorically, and it's almost a moral imperative that they do not treat their art as financial assets. That this is a calling, this is, and maybe they're a bit scared, therefore, or resistant because it doesn't sound like part of their moral system around their art collecting, or even art making. This can be extended to the artist who's resistive to ideas of totally monetizing or marketizing their artwork. What you've been talking about, Zineng, is actually, you can actually put an entire collection on the blockchain and create a type of provenance. And in a sense, there could be a degree of transparency among collectors about who, collections, about sharing. So there's also something else happening, that the market becomes an interesting piggyback system to grow these other things. So I'm wondering, when you're encountering people asking you about this, Zineng, this whole question about, are they talking just about assets? Are they talking about art? Or are there people in this middle ground who are hoping that uptake is more, so that this technology has other functions other than the dominant discourse right now around speculation?
Yeah, I mean, blockchain, NFT, three words kind of define the spectrum of interest in it, right? You have speculation, and speculation is not helped by hype. There is a great deal of hype, there is a great deal of headline news going into NFTs and then blockchain. Then in the middle ground, people want to sort out whether there's an investment aspect to things. And it's an interesting point because if you think about the investment value of a work of art, in this case with digital art, NFTs, there is the underlying reliance on a alternative currency, cryptocurrency. So then it's an odd onto an odd. So that's pretty deep, pretty difficult market-wise to deal with. And then some of these projects that we've had the chance to talk about tracking authenticity and provenance, centers around the utility of blockchain technology, how it helps the art world, how it helps to democratize access. So, yeah, if we frame it in that way, depends where you want to really sit, where you want to look in the whole chain of things. Yeah, I would say so.
Thank you so much for all your very deep answers and insightful answers, because you're actually giving us a lot of detail for navigating this space. we have quite a number of actually still public questions, and I apologize to the public that we can't go through all of them. But what I'm going to do is consolidate 2 last questions before we'll hand over to Nadia and close out today. So I'm going to start with a theoretical one that's asked for all of this, and if we could keep this short. We stumbled into this a bit, but we never gave a concrete answer around this. Are there any gatekeepers, or is the point of blockchain technology to not have any gatekeepers at all? I know we've talked about gatekeepers already, even within the traditional art world, but maybe we can articulate again what the gatekeepers really are in the sort of blockchain technology world right now for artists, but also for dealers trying to get into this space.
For me, gatekeepers and tastemakers, the platforms, the evolving roles that platforms play, that concerns tastemaking, curation, but they are also, in that sense, to be seen as gatekeepers. And I would locate the discussion around platforms, honestly.
Yeah, I think many people have expertise and their knowledge in art history, and they can kind of bring something there by, like what you mentioned, tastemaking. And I don't see that as a problem, but it's only a problem when there is no other alternative for the artist to, put their work out there. So if you're talking about the gatekeepers within NFTs, those will be the kind of curated platforms that are selecting or limiting the amount of people that can be on their platforms. And it's not necessarily a bad thing as long as we have options of the publicly accessible ones that exist.
I don't really have specific roles that I think are gatekeepers, but I think the things to keep in mind are that access to, say, minting NFTs or being a successful, like very sellable NFT artist, the kind of market forces that can influence that are still very much the same as, say, in the IRL world, in real life world. And so, for example, it's access to capital, right? You talked about this earlier too, situated in different economies or societies where it's legal and easy to purchase cryptocurrencies, to have stable internet access, to be able to speak fluent English because much of the conversation moves in English, or to have access to certain connections that can get you on either different platforms or being reported by mainstream media for your work to be seen. And these are all things that still the same, structures and mechanisms that contribute to how you could perform as an artist. It still lies in the same ways in the NFT world. So in a way, it's sure there aren't gatekeepers in the sense of like, yeah, if this platform doesn't work, you can always go on OpenSea or you can go on Hikaknunk. Like there are alternatives to that, right? But the fundamental mechanisms that can reduce access or that can limit access to exclusive groups lie the same.
Yeah. And I think we didn't get to talk about this, but another way of kind of democratizing what projects gets funding within the NFT space is through the use of a DAO, so a decentralized autonomous organization. I think we wanted to talk a little bit about that, but this might be better for like a extended series rather than a short panel.
No, definitely. Especially because there are some targeted questions from the public actually, or the audience, the online audience for you, Jonathan, and these are more know-how questions, right? So what are examples of impressive marketing promoting methods in NFT with less structure and low barrier to entry? It can be hard to stand out amongst the crowd. So what is the best way to market yourself as an emerging artist who wants to sell their work? Do you have any advice for this?
I'm going to model my answer after Siobhan, who I think is one of the most, Siobhan Wang, who manages to market her work very effectively. And I think the way she approaches it is to be out there with your work, always be talking about your work, but also engage with your audience and not just talk about your work. So in the NFT space, there's this term called shilling, where you go into a room and you say, this is my project, go check it out. Don't do that, but rather engage with the community or the space that you're in, talk to them, and then assert yourself in that space and assert yourself in that conversation. When people engage with your artworks, talk to them and ask them what they like, what they don't like, and basically just to be everywhere. Which, you know, a lot of artists struggle with that.
It's about building connection
Yeah.
and building community and like actively participating. So not just seeking for like self-interest. And in some cases that does work out. But a lot of artists, you know, building off of what Siobhan and John are saying, they really benefit from just being present and contributing to conversation and having their name all over Twitter just because they're so present in the community. And that's like one way in which you are marketing yourself, you're promoting your online brand.
So it sounds so much that, you know, we talk about marketing and promotion, but it's really, when we get to the heart of things, it's about building communities and networks. And so much of this is about communities and networks. All right, we're going to end the talk here because we're going to transition, but I would like to just allow you guys the opportunity to have a final word. We do have a couple questions that we never answered, such as like, how do I get into this? How do I ease myself into NFT buying? So if your last statements before we close out this panel, what would you say to an audience who wants to be part of this new emerging community? You know, how do we get into this network? Like, you know, as an artist or maybe as a, you know, aspirational collector, or even as maybe someone who wants to get into this as maybe another dealer. What would be some advice that you guys have? If you could do it in a sentence, and I'm giving you the impossible task, but final words, please.
Focus on educating yourself about the underlying tech. I think that's very important. Familiarize yourself with the settlement currency, the cryptocurrency, and also find communities and support sources that are credible and also supportive in helping artists kind of onboard into the space, like NFT Asia.
Don't be judgmental on the aesthetics. Keep an open eye and open mind as well with regards to the kind of new visual sensations that will hit you with digital art.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo John's statement. I think recognizing that this is something that is happening, it doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. And even if you are fundamentally, principally opposed to it, I think it can be really important to educate yourself and to become fluent in this technology and the vocabularies around it to be able to then hold longer conversations to work towards, you know, the futures that you do believe in. Yeah.
Thank you. That's actually a very inspirational and poetic ending and a very nice final word. So thank you all for joining me this afternoon, and those of you online. Thank you, Zineng, Jonathan, and Clara. This has certainly been a very enlightening discussion for me, and you know, I hope that all of you in 2022 keep building your networks and communities and build more consensus around this emerging space in art. All right, I'm going to hand over.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Yes, thank you for having us, Art and Market.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for spending time with us today. If you would like to find out more about all the talks in SAW Dialogues 2022, like the one you've attended today, please scan the QR code on the screen right now. All recordings of the panels will also be available for viewing indefinitely on SAW Digital. Do also look out for the summaries of each panel that will be released on artandmarket.net, where we share key takeaways from each talk for SAW Dialogues. Before you go, do help us complete a survey to improve the program for the next Singapore Art Week. I'll give you a moment to scan the QR code that's appearing on screen right now. And when you have completed the survey, you can take a screenshot of the submission page and show it at the info booths at Block 47 and Block 9 at Gilman Barracks to collect complimentary SAW 2022 merchandise. SAW Dialogues 2022 is presented by Art and Market in partnership with National Arts Council Singapore. See you all at the next talk. Bye.